Hello, my name is Professor Dr. Anthony Teitler, and a very, very warm welcome to Introduction to International Relations to this module. I will be going through during the course of these next number of lectures over the course of the next number of weeks and months, a range of different theories and concepts of international relations, plus how these different theories and concepts relate to the field of international relations, different issue areas, whether it's human rights, political economy, foreign policy, international security, environmental issues, etc., etc. I really, really look forward to meeting and working with you in class. These videos will be a good learning tool for you, dare I say, in terms of me going through some of the key contents and materials that will then be reinforcing and going through in more detail during class time. So without further ado, what I would like to do is share with you my screen, because I'm going to go through the first presentation. And then when I've gone through the presentation itself, you'll be able to watch and we'll be able to talk about again, as I said, in class time. So again, without going on too much, I want to crack on now with international relations, introduction to theories and concepts. And what I hope to do during the course of this presentation, but also future presentations, is explain and demonstrate why theory is relevant. Theory, in a sense, is sometimes seen as something overly abstract. So when you read a newspaper or watch something on television or the social media, what have you, there's a lot of information, a lot of data coming in your direction. How do you make sense of it all? How do you get an understanding? So what are your assumptions, your ontology, your ontological assumptions of what exists in the world? How do you generate this knowledge? How do you know about something? This is epistemology. Some of these terms I will be going back over time. So please don't feel the necessity to know everything that I say today. And by the way, when I go through all these theories today, it's not the case by the end of this presentation that you'll be an expert. It will take time, and I will be going separately in individual presentations through each individual theory, because it takes time to learn these theories. But by the end of this module, I really hope that you'll feel more comfortable with theory, why theory is relevant, and how it applies to a range of different political, economic, philosophical issues in this world of ours. And the relationship between theory and practice. And again, I would just say briefly something about theory. Its relevance is important because you want to understand certain patterns and processes. So by seeing certain pictures, patterns, processes of an issue area, you need to bring in theory to get to think about it in a systematic way. So then you can have a, let's say, a wider but also deeper understanding of the issue in question. And also you can understand how, let's say, institutions, human beings who make up these institutions, why they do what they do, possibly how these institutions have evolved historically, and not only where they are now, which is important to study and understand contemporary context, but possibly even to make predictions for the future. Although making predictions for the future, especially in the social world, has elements of complexity. Why? For the simple reason, that human beings tend to be unpredictable in certain contexts, at least. With that said, I now want to crack on with these slides, and you can see the first slide. Now, we'll be talking about this in class time, but as you can see from this image, it's an image of a range of diplomats, and it happens to be connected with the United Nations. So this is the United Nations Security Council in session. United Nations Security Council is one of the six bodies that makes up the galaxy of what is known as the United Nations. It's a particularly important body. Why? Because it decides questions of international security and international law. So the relationship between international security and the fact that what is decided in this particular body is legally binding. This makes this a particularly powerful body, which is the United Nations Security Council. And I'll be talking much more about the United Nations in the second set of presentations, so the second presentation, and the history of it, how it came out of the horrors of the Second World War, to prevent further bloodshed, further wars in the future, peace and security, so a cooperative idea. But we'll also be looking at these different theories to see how there's tension. Often there's power politics involved. So 5 of the 15 members of this United Nations Security Council are the permanent 5. This comes back to this notion of history, the importance of history, and the so-called victors of the Second World War, i.e. what was then the Soviet Union, but today would be the Russia, United States, United Kingdom, France, and also China. China was particularly considered important also by Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the UK during the Second World War, because he wanted to see a world where these countries could collectively, responsibly come together and actually play a so-called global police role, for better or worse. And again, we'll be looking at the different theories. So that's something that I'll be talking about in more detail in the second set of slides and so a second presentation. But for now, I want to take us into some of the key concepts that I want you to be aware of. So some key basic terms to start off with. In social theory and sociology, more broadly, social theory, sociology, I should say, there are certain terms that are important. There are terms that I want you to be aware of. The first one is the notion of an actor. Sometime in sociology, you hear structure and agency. But here I just want to focus on an actor, which is an agent, which is whether you or I as an individual. It can also be, as you can see from the slide, a president, a king, a queen, and various different actors, organizations like a labor union, a political party, a nation state, whether we're talking about Nigeria, Egypt, Turkey, whatever the case might be, that each of these actors have certain purposes, certain objectives that they want to achieve. And whether it's an individual or an entity that's made up of a whole collection of individuals, so in the case of China, 1.3 billion people, nonetheless, it will have a governance structure and a president and a government that makes key decisions in terms of China's relationship with other parts of the world. But nonetheless, there are also non-state actors that also want to play a role in influencing a government, but also other actors in the system. So countries like China or the United States or Germany, they obviously have a government that in a sense governs and creates its policy and its international relations, but there are other actors within a society that play a role. And obviously it can depend on the type of governance structure. So if one talks about a totalitarian system compared to a liberal democracy, to make an obvious differentiation, we can see the difference there in that there would be less actors having an influence within a totalitarian system, all things being equal. Nonetheless, and again, this is the point I want to make, actors have certain purpose, they have certain objectives, and they always have to work within a structure, whether it's a rigid, fixed, materialistic structure or social structure. I'll be coming back to this term later on, but the structure is something that one has to operate within. So you are working within a structure now of a university system. There are rules, regulations, norms of what you should do, what's appropriate, what you ought to do. So at the end of this particular module, you'll each give a group presentation. You have certain objectives working within this structure. So the rules and regulations are set up, but you as an actor work with that structure. Sometimes you can change the structure, but often you have to work with that structure, with the rules and regulations, let's say, of your presentation that you give at the end of this semester, to get potentially a good result at the end of it. And hopefully, above all else, you learn something during the course of this module. Now, whether we look at, let's say, actors and how they impact on the international system, and here again, it's not just individuals, but you can have nation states, you can have regional actors such as the European Union, which plays, as you know, an increasingly influential role as an independent actor within the international system. And then, as I've referred to, the United Nations, which has a whole host of different agencies and bodies. Anyway, anyone that wants to achieve something politically has a political objective. Again, it could be a non-state actor like Amnesty International wanting to improve human rights issues and situations in different parts of the world for prisoners of conscience and others. Then it's this particular notion that we have to consider. So whenever you hear the term actor or agent, think of it as a unit, individual or otherwise, that actually wants to achieve a particular objective. And it wants to achieve it politically speaking. Paradigm is something important, because we're thinking of, when we go into these theories, the basic assumptions, ontological assumptions we have about a field of study. So what are the primary things we focus on? And again, with these theories that I'm about to touch upon, they zone in on particular aspects of international relations that these particular theorists deem most relevant. So we want to understand these basic assumptions, how there are different paradigms, and how there are different approaches to understanding the world. An analogy that I use, it's also not just my analogy, it's something that's used in Globalization of World Politics and by other scholars, but it's this idea of wearing a pair of glasses. And depending on, let's say, the lenses of the glasses, it might make you see the world in a slightly different way. And this is something that we can think of, this analogy, when we look at the world of international relations, how theory also gives us a particular lens. It doesn't mean that one theory explains everything. Of course it doesn't. And that's why we need a range of different theories to get closer to having a so-called accurate picture of the world that we live in and our own place in it. So again, these units of analysis, or units of analysis that I've referred to, it could be you or I as individuals. And of course, a particular president or prime minister or chancellor or CEO, or in some cases head of an NGO, may have more influence than you or I. But nonetheless, each of us have certain objectives that we want to achieve. Another one would be at the nation state. Again, whether we talk about examples, there are many, of course, Italy, the United Kingdom, Israel, Saudi Arabia, China, etc., etc. Each of these have certain historical context to them of what makes them this particular entity in this particular time period, and they always have certain objectives that they're trying to achieve. Non-state and or transnational actors. So non-state actors, and here I've given you some obvious examples: Greenpeace, Al-Qaeda, Amnesty International, Microsoft. Very, very different actors with very, very different objectives. And something that I want to emphasize here as well, this notion of transnational. So it's not just international between nations, nation states, but it's also something that goes beyond. So the news broadcaster CNN, 24-hour news, they often made this point that they were not just between countries, they went beyond. So when you look at a terrorist actor like Al-Qaeda, or a human rights actor like Amnesty International, again, two very different actors, they both have certain objectives, but it's not just between states, it's something global, transnational, goes beyond. And finally, international organizations, again, whether we talk about the United Nations and the different agencies and bodies, but also whether you talk about regional organizations, the African Union, the Arab League, something that's very, very institutionalized, the European Union. These are also actors that play a role in the world that we live in. Now, what is the purpose of IR theory? Well, I'm going to give you three purposes and briefly talk through each one. Why is it relevant? So again, something I really, really want to emphasize is you want to understand certain patterns and processes of this world that we live in and our place in it. So actor and structure, again, what we do as individuals and collective entities, working with a particular structure, reproducing the structure or changing it, what have you. So we have to look at understanding how, let's say, different issue areas have evolved over time. What are certain patterns and processes that we can fit together to get a slightly clearer and more systematic picture of the world we live in, and possibly what we can do with that information. And here we can bring in normative aspects of how we can, what we should do, and this is where we bring in ethics. But theory in and of itself tries to understand these different patterns, processes, and makes it more robust, so we can actually understand things more systematically, perhaps see how a particular issue or particular case may have connections with another case or another issue. And this is where theory becomes important. And then we can understand some of these big questions. So why war? Why peace? Again, this is where theory and concepts play an important role, because from, let's say, theory and its associated concepts that connect with it, we're trying to understand, why is there war? Why was there conflict in this particular part of the world? So why, let's say, have in recent times Ethiopia and Eritrea had difficult relations? Why is it the case that Israel and Palestine have had difficult relations and continue to do so, etc.? And these are just two of many, many examples. Finally, of theory and why it's relevant, there's a normative component to it. Now, you'll hear and I go through the different theories, certain in future sessions with realism, and particularly neorealism that I'll emphasize, and liberal aspects of liberalism or liberal institutionalism, which talks about that we are positivistic, we're scientific, we just understand it, we give it you a clearer understanding of the world, and that's the end of the story. There's not really ethics involved. We'll see how realism and liberalism also actually have a normative analysis and component. And by normative, we go to this notion that comes from the term norms of what we ought to do, what is appropriate. Normative also talks about how we should do things. So descriptive would just say, look, this is what's taken place, this is what we can think about, and this is where possibly it's going. Normative is also bringing in an ethical component by saying, what should we do? What ought we to do? And of course, human rights is something that will, and animal rights more broadly is important, but it brings in this notion of what ought we to do with this knowledge that we have. How do we make a situation potentially better and not worse, which is a complicated question. So briefly, I mean, history is a very, very important subject area. As you're well aware, international relations is a very, very interdisciplinary subject area, takes in a whole host of different subjects: politics, economics, philosophy, geography, cultural studies, engineering, and forgive me, and also history. History is very important. So you want to have a historical context to everything. So you're not just looking at events for the first time. Actually, there are trends and processes that have taken place historically, decisions that different actors have made to create certain institutions that have created a particular context. Now, what IR is not, though, is not that IR and history are the same thing. History is one subject of many that makes up IR. However, one of the differences between, let's say, three differences that I've identified between IR theory and history for history's sake, although history, of course, is a very rich and important subject in its own right, is that historians tend to look at an event and they see it as fairly unique. So what IR theory and theory in general is trying to do is trying to get us, as I've said before, a certain systematic way so that we can make generalizations, representations, so we can understand how this event might have linkages with another event. Historians tend to say, no, let's just write and analyze as effectively as we can a particular special event, and we're wary of making generalizations from this. Whereas IR theory would say, generally speaking, we can, forgive the pun, repetition, we can actually make generalizations from looking at particular events. So this notion, let's say, an example in liberal thought, democratic peace theory, that countries don't go to war with one another, two democratic countries, I should say, and by looking at this empirically over 100 years, you identify that this may well be the case or is the case, and then that's something that generates some general assumption, which is made up of a theory, which is liberalism or an aspect of liberalism. Historians are slightly more skeptical. But again, I simplify slightly just to show you some differences, because a historian also acknowledges that there are sometimes cases where we can make analogies and connections. Secondly, yes, we want to strive for objectivity and understanding it, but as a historian, it's sometimes more complicated. Why? Because again, if it's difficult to make generalizations, then there is an element where the historian, he or she, is coming into it and trying to amass further evidence, but it's very difficult to be entirely objective with this process. Nonetheless, according to IR theory and relevant historians too, we ought to strive for objectivity and be systematic and rigorous in whatever approach we take to understanding something in the social political world. So there are connections as well. And historians are wary of making future predictions. Of course, making predictions is always fraught with complexity, again, as I've said, in the social world. But IR theorists tend to say, if you can say, we can look at this, we can see how this pattern's going, it makes it likely that if we can say this, then this is possible to happen. So this is, again, a difference between IR theory and historians. But again, not a complete difference, because some historians also make predictions based on what they know from the past, but there is a skepticism. Now, history of IR theory. So we look at, let's say, some key elements within this. So we have to go back now to ancient Greek thought, as there's also ancient Chinese thought and a range of other great schools of thought, but I've identified these particular ones as a way of understanding what the discipline of IR is and some of the key influences, for better or worse, because the influences within IR and how IR has evolved as a subject is also based on choice made by scholars, so there's a power element of what's included and what isn't included. With that stated, Thucydides, who we'll come across again when we look at realism in the third set of slides, third session, what have you, third presentation. And we'll be looking at how this particular thinker is an important start to what comes later as realism. And he looks at how two powerful actors, one rising, one declining, in the case of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, led to, doesn't have to, of course, but led to a conflict, and that power, in a sense, makes right. Again, I will be looking in more detail at Thucydides and what realism is, and going through the history of realist thought. But IR scholarship refers back to key events in history and key thinkers in history. So it's not just a subject area which, and some of you I spoke to when I interviewed you to join the Karlshochschule. International relations as a subject area started after the First World War. First chair was awarded at Aberystwyth University. And that is the case that it's a young discipline, but it's been around in terms of key thinkers for hundreds, nay, thousands of years. In the, let's say, from the end of the Middle Ages, so going into the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment period, you have key thinkers like Machiavelli, an important Renaissance thinker, that he counseled realism to be realistic in terms of what you can achieve as a statesman or woman. Thomas Hobbes, also the relevance of the state and power and authority. Immanuel Kant, a very, very significant Enlightenment thinker. Some of his notions of, let's say, that I've referred to before, that liberals take, like democratic peace theory, goes back to some of Kant's own writings in ethics, and how we as human beings, the Enlightenment, we have capability to think critically and rationally and create institutions internationally, republican systems, to create a more peaceful world. And finally, Karl Marx, a key thinker of the 19th century, mid-19th century, looking at the notions of capitalism, exploitation, inequality in the world, and what can be done to change it, to alleviate inequality, etc., etc. I won't go into further great detail about these thinkers, but they are important because some of these ideas will come up time and again in the next number of theories that we come across today, but also in future sessions. And they're key thinkers for you to think about. However, if we were to be critical from, let's say, a more post-structural or critical theory or post-colonial approach, and I'll be going in, again, referring to these terms later, then we can notice that most of these thinkers happen to be white European men, particularly Machiavelli to Marx, as I've referred to. And there is a short-sightedness, there's a bias potentially here in the discipline that we need to consider and be sensitive to. Finally, I should go on now to talk about the carnage of the First World War and how it created particular approaches to the world we live in: realism, liberal internationalism, and Marxism. These were the key approaches after the First World War. And again, I'm not going to go into detail now about it because I'm about to be talking about each theory in the next slides. But just bear in mind that these particular theories, particularly realism, even today, liberal internationalism and Marxism, after the First World War, were seen as key approaches. At the end of the Second World War and the horrors of the Second World War, and leading to the Cold War and this bipolar world, and here we talk a bit about realism, two superpowers, i.e. the United States on one side and the Soviet Union on the other, and a bipolar world where they balance each other out. This led to this notion of power politics, and where we come into realism, and how the world operates, often was seen as operating through a realist lens. At the end of the Cold War, so from 1989 to 1991, this time period, other more critical approaches come into play, and where it's not just about power politics and the most powerful actors in the system, and that's the full story, and that they just want to achieve more power. The according to realists. Here you can see how we have human agency, consciousness, ideas, norms, language, constructivism, and other approaches. Feminism, critical theory comes more prominent in IR theory at the end of the Cold War, to suggest actually it's not just all about elites wanting power to be the most powerful actor, state actor in this case, if you're a realist, but actually there are other actors that are important, and actually even these powerful actors themselves don't always necessarily want to be powerful for power's sake. And Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader at the end of the Cold War, is often cited as an example of someone, by Alexander Wendt, an important constructivist scholar. Mikhail Gorbachev is seen as someone who actually didn't operate according to realist logic. Now, I'm going to go through these 6 theories. And I should just say one thing, that I've put post-structuralism actually at the end. So it's not in this exact order. But basically, these schools of thought, realism, liberal institutionalism, constructivism, Marxism and critical theory, feminism, and post-structuralism. So post-structuralism becomes F in a sense. These different approaches, they are some of the key approaches that you will come across when you study the subject of international relations. So in this presentation, we're doing a huge amount of groundwork for you to understand the discipline of IR and the key theories. But again, you will be coming across these approaches time and time again. So please don't fret if you don't understand everything today from this particular presentation, and we'll talk in more detail in class and in future sessions. So, realists. What do realists see? Well, they see it's all about security and power. So IR theorists, and again, future presentations, I'll go into more detail. So specifically, I'll just have one presentation on realism. But they look at how there's security in the world and power, and how in particular nation states are front and center. There's a term that I've highlighted there, which is called anarchy. And anarchy does not mean what sometimes is meant in political philosophy, of this notion of decentralized, there's no central authority, and basically different actors having power and influence, and that, let's say, a critique of government, and that government plays a negative role in taking power away from the people, etc., etc. And forgive that wasn't the greatest explanation of anarchy, but you get my point, that is commonly associated with, let's say, political philosophy. However, anarchy, according to realists, has a slightly different meaning. So a new meaning for you, dare I say. And it makes the point that there's no supranational, supra, S-U-P-R-A, there's no authority above us in international relations. So state, also non-state actors, but realists put an emphasis on state actors. States themselves there's no world government, no supranational authority to protect us. So we live, according to realists and neo-realists, I'll tell you the difference shortly, in this anarchical world system. This anarchical world system means that we have to consider that actually no one is going to protect us. So I'm Germany, or I'm Brazil. I have to look out for my state. Why? Because no one else is going to. There's no world government, there's no supranational authority to protect us. And we can see from history that if you don't look out for yourself, you're going to not even in some cases survive. The case of Poland in the 19th century. So we live, according to realists, in this anarchical world system. An absence of central authority, no supranational authority. So we have to look out for ourselves first and foremost. So it's a theory premised on self-interest. Security and power is paramount, materialistically speaking. So since the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, which was a key treaty, that gets us to think, it's particularly in a European context, European-centric, you could say, of let's say this notion of sovereignty, autonomy for states that has evolved since 1648 to the present time, that we look at how, let's say, states interact when it comes to international relations. So questions of security and survival, when other states may be, let's say, wanting to harm us. Again, you might say, well, in the European context, it's not exactly the case. Yes, although European itself has had a bloody history. and dare I say, it's not necessarily the case that Europe will always be living in a peaceful context, although I hope it does live in a peaceful context. But in other parts of the world, this realist paradigm makes perhaps more sense in terms of, let's say, that we live in a dangerous world. But again, when we look at it, this is a construct that we look at, and we look at how, let's say, nation states think and operationalize security and power within this system. So state actors, they live in this anarchical world, so they have to survive. They want to balance their power with others, and in some cases get more power. But they don't want to have more power whereby the other country in question feels threatened and then can go to war. So there's always a question. Realists are not arguing that nation states ought to go to war. If anything, they're counseling restraint. And often that is the case, that they counsel restraint. But if you don't trust the intentions of another side and you see a country getting a bit more power, then you think that other country, country A, might want to do something to you, country B. This is where you get into what's known as a security dilemma. Can I trust country A? Not necessarily. Therefore, I will build up my military. Country A sees what country B is doing and says, oh, you're building up your military. Obviously, you have hostile intentions towards us. And so this mistrust can lead, in a worst case scenario, to a war. But again, realists counsel against wars 9 times out of 10. Realists also talk about this notion of a unitary actor. So you have a prime minister, president, chancellor, depending on the political system, his or her government, key ministries, and these actors together make up what's known as the national interest. And strictly speaking, for most realists, domestic politics is not too important. Again, I'm going to mention different realist approaches in the realist presentation, but generally speaking, we live in a world where actually you have elites, and these elites within a particular country, they actually emphasize their own role in doing, in this case, international relations, foreign policy, what have you, and that threats are external, not so much internal. You can see some issues there already. And just to say, realism is an approach that Hans Morgenthau, Second World War, post-Second World War context. One of the key differences between classical realism and neo-realism, new realism, structural realism, which really comes in the late 1970s, Kenneth Waltz, who you can see there is very important, they put an emphasis on the structure of the international system, the neo-realists. Earlier on, you have great thinkers like Hans Morgenthau, who would be known as classical realists, and they put more of an emphasis on human nature. So looking at the horrors of the Second World War, Hans Morgenthau and others worries about, let's say, human nature is the way it is, and we can't deny it. We would like human beings to be different, but unfortunately they're self-interested, selfish, have sometimes bad intentions, etc., etc. We can just do our best, but often it might be the case that when we have a conflictual situation, we have to deal with it head on. That's, again, classical realists, this notion of human nature. What is human nature? Which tends to take a pessimistic view to human nature. Not entirely pessimistic, but on the more pessimistic side. And again, I've referred to thinkers before like Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. Morgenthau is influenced by some of these key thinkers, and he's a seminal thinker in classical realism. Again, I'll go into more detail. In the late 1970s, you have thinkers like Kenneth Waltz, and later on Barry Pose and Stephen Walt and others, who emphasize the structure of the international system. And because we have a particular structure, and countries, almost like this notion from physics, have to have an equilibrium, balance against each other. If it gets disjointed, then you get into a conflictual situation. Having this balance, whether a bipolar world, or if there's 3 or more countries that are equally or more or less the same power, then it's a multipolar world. This is where structure becomes important, and it's seen as a more scientific, according to Kenneth Waltz, as positivistic, that you look at the world in let's say, through structure. Human nature is too fuzzy a concept, according to Kenneth Waltz, and you can see the structure, you can understand certain patterns and make predictions from that. Again, I will be going into more detail in this in the next presentation, but these are some of the key concepts that we come across for realism, classical realism in the case of Hans Morgenthau, and neo-realism or structural realism, used as synonyms as per a great scholar like Kenneth Waltz. So, liberalism and liberal institutionalism. We look at this notion of international cooperation. So I referred to the United Nations before, and we can look at how different, particularly state actors, there are non-state actors that play a role, and of course play, and according to liberals and liberal institutionalists, non-state actors, whether Microsoft, Siemens, Greenpeace, do play an important role, and realists underemphasize this, according to liberals, liberal institutionalists. But one key difference between liberals and realists is the following. Liberals put an emphasis on international cooperation, which is a mutual advantage for both. Realists are not against that idea, and they actually can sign up to the idea that there can be a mutual advantage from both sides. However, and this is a key difference, the concept of absolute gains and relative gains. So absolute gains and relative gains. Relative gains is the situation a more realist approach. Why? Because there are two state actors. If one actor, so it's actor A, Germany, actor B, France, if actor A, Germany, gets 8 and actor B, France, gets 6, Germany has obviously benefited more from this exchange, this interaction. So it has a relative gain of 2 in relation to France. 8 for Germany, 6 for France is a relative gain. Why? Because according to realists, it's about competition. Sometimes it's about this notion of security, etc., etc. However, and here we'll see problems with it according to constructivists, because actually constructivists would say it's also how we're socialized. Germans and French, Germany and France as two states, see each other as friends. So it's not the same as two countries that see each other in a very negative light. Actually, according to constructivists, because these two actors see each other in a positive light, it's not that straightforward. Nonetheless, constructivism, we come back to later. So again, relative gains according to realists, this is the concept for microeconomics. Germany 8, 6 for France, that's a relative gain for Germany, therefore Germany has benefited more from that interaction, therefore it's a relative gain. And it's always about the competition between the two actors according to realists. According to liberals, liberal institutionalism, but also something that you come across in economics. So David Ricardo, one of the great classical economists alongside Adam Smith, and later on Karl Marx in the 19th century, who critiques classical economics, but is influenced by it. Absolute gains, so as a liberal that we have with free trade as well today, 21st century, is a notion that both sides can benefit from an interaction. Both sides can benefit from trading with one another. More interdependence, both sides becoming more prosperous. So this notion, again, if we want to take France and Germany as the example, by both sides interacting, whether through trade, cultural exchanges, some other area, it's a win-win situation. So that's what's known as absolute gains. Both sides benefit, it's a win-win situation. And that is a more liberal or liberal institutionalist notion. And this idea of international society, and I just throw some terms out for you, you don't need to remember all of this, but it's just so you hear it, that the English school and constructivists go on about as well, refer to. Here, there's an emphasis that the liberals make on, previously it would have been the League of Nations during the interwar period, First World War to Second World War, but in the post-Second World War, the United Nations. But creating more pooling of resources, trust, etc., you create these international institutions, organizations, agencies within the UN, as the example is, to create more interaction, more mutual interdependence, and you create, supposedly from this, a more peaceful global order. Like realists, liberals or liberal institutionalists say that, of course, states are extremely important actors. And here I put here main actors, but you have to consider also that there are other actors in the world, so non-state actors, international bodies, and key individuals as well. Each of these different actors that are part of a network system make up the international order that we're part of, and that just emphasizing the state is overly simplifying a more complicated world, according to liberals and liberal institutionalists. They also say, well, hang on a second, realists, especially you structural realists, neo-realists, what do you mean that the domestic context isn't important? Well, hang on a second. If you live in a more democratic society or more authoritarian system, according to liberals, that's going to impact on how a state operates not only domestically but also how it would operate internationally. So hence this notion that I've referred to before, that comes from the Kantian notion, Immanuel Kant, democratic peace theory, that democracies don't go to war with one another, or less likely to go to war with one another. Again, it's not saying democracies are necessarily more peaceful with non-democracies. It's not making that point. And you have key thinkers in this area in the late 20th century, like Bruce Russett and others. And as per your readings, you'll read some of these key arguments. So according to liberals, actually, yes, domestic context, political systems, etc., doesn't also make a role. Realists are too simplistic here. Finally, neoliberals, and don't confuse this term neoliberals, or we use this as a synonym, neoliberal or liberal institutionalists. And two key scholars, Bob Cohen and Joseph Nye, don't confuse neoliberals with neoliberalism, the economic theory which refers to privatization, deregulation, etc., etc. Neoliberals or neoliberalism and liberal institutionalism in IR has a different meaning to what it does in economics and economic thought. So neoliberalism or liberal institutionalists, used as a synonym, emphasizes this complexity of the world that we live in and how we pool resources between different international institutions and organizations, and how there's a complexity and a cobweb of these different, let's say, approaches, and how it's not just state-to-state relations, but societies, and the relationship between states and societies, not only domestically, that internationally plays a role in shaping the particular global order that we become accustomed to. And again, so for Bob Cohen and Joseph Nye, so liberal institutionalists, really from the 1970s onwards, they're trying to understand why there are many different subject areas that play a role. So it's not just about power politics and the military, but actually we have to look at environmental issues, finance, societal issues, etc., etc. Each of these issues are part of a cobweb, play a role in making up these in different institutions. And according to Cohen, Nye, and other liberal institutionalists or neoliberals in IR thought, not necessarily economic thought, IR thought, the more pooling of resources, working closely, trading more, creating more interdependence, creates, hypothetically speaking, a more peaceful world. Constructivism. And this is a key approach, and there's a clear difference between constructivism and realism. And both of these first two approaches that I spoke about, Marxism as well has some connection in a small way with realism, liberal institutionalism in this way, although it has different political objectives and ideas. But nonetheless, each of these approaches basically refers to this material world we live in. It's material factors that dominate, shape the world we live in. Not so fast, according to constructivists. Why? Because it's actually, at least, yes, there's a material reality, this world that we live in, and whether we have war, whether let's say how trade works, etc., etc. But actually, a lot of what this is, it's based on how belief systems are constructed. So I often, when I'm in a classroom, give a notion of, I look at a chair, and I get you to think of a chair. And I would say, what is this object? And you say, well, it's a chair. And I say, okay, it's a chair. Why is it a chair? And it's often because over time, we've become accustomed to this notion of a chair being a chair. The actual object itself is a meaning we've given to it in a particular historical context, which today we take for granted. The same with traffic lights. So what does red mean? For a traffic light? I know you know the answer. It means when you're driving, you should stop. There's a law. And it's not just in the UK, or Germany, it's anywhere, everywhere. Green means go, right? That is something that was made in a particular historical context. Then there are certain norms, rules, laws that were created whereby we don't think about it anymore. That green means to go, red means to stop. These belief systems that have been created in a particular historical social context is something we take for granted. It becomes a habit, but it's something that's not from nature. It's not given from nature like gravity. So if I drop a pen, drop a pencil, what happens? It falls to the ground. Whether I believe or not in gravity, it doesn't matter. It's a brute fact. It happens regardless of my belief systems. However, according to constructivists, that's brute facts. And we agree that gravity is gravity regardless of my belief systems. It's a brute fact. However, a social fact is a traffic light, or how we perceive a chair. A traffic light, green means go, red means stop. Okay, that's a social fact that we all understand, and it's a habit. There are laws in place, etc. But it's not something given from nature. So we also have to look at how the world has been constructed over time. How, let's say, the Cold War was very much a reality according to constructivists from 1947 to 1991, whatever dates we exactly want to give for the Cold War. But it was something, belief systems that you had in Washington, in Moscow, and other parts of the world, believing that the one side was an enemy rather than a friend, created certain social structures that these actors operated in, and therefore conflicted with, or at least had difficult relations, etc., etc. And then we come to the end of the Cold War, where you have an actor like Gorbachev who tries to change these belief systems. Because he's a powerful actor, he could do this, and changing and indirectly creating a new global order post-Cold War context. Now, so we can see that sociology plays a role. It's socially constructed, and norms, what our belief systems, what we consider appropriate. So again, if you see me, constructivism now, if you see me walking past you, the norm 9 times out of 10, depending on one's social or cultural context, is to say hello. Hello, Mr. Teitler. Hello, Professor Teitler. Hello, Anthony, however you refer to me, and I say hello back to you. That's a norm that we have, let's say, upheld. We don't have to. There's nothing, let's say, telling us that we have to say hello to each other. We could ignore each other, but there are certain things in certain social, cultural contexts that are deemed appropriate or inappropriate. Again, I want to emphasize this because we look at how, let's say, the norm of let's say, whether we should get rid of nuclear weapons, why there's a nuclear taboo, why countries themselves perceive it as wrong. And yet, of course, some of the more powerful countries have nuclear weapons. This is how norms play a role. And again, a key concept here is social meaning. So if I deem you as a friend, or I deem you as a competition, or I deem you as an enemy, that's 3 different possible relationships I can have with you. So state actors, Germany and France, as I gave before, India and Pakistan, Brazil and Argentina, how they perceive each other and how they therefore interact with each other is dependent, therefore can lead to different outcomes. So it's not axiomatic. It's not like 1 + 1 = 2, that basically 2 countries are going to conflict, let's say, be enemies, as some realists would generally speaking sign up to, or be in competition, as liberals would sign up to. No, they could also be friends, according to constructivists, and therefore they have a different relationship. And arguably, despite some of the negatives of the European Union, some of the more positive aspects is how it's socialized and made a certain region more peaceful over time, according to constructivists. And again, it's intersubjective. So this does not mean that all our belief systems. So if I think right now, or I am I don't know, what can I say that I am? I'm a giraffe, okay? If I say to you I'm a giraffe, you just think, okay, this is crazy, etc., etc. Also, biologically speaking, I can't be. However, so it's not just like any idea, any crazy idea one might have, but it's not entirely objective as well. And what do I mean by that is often a lot of these things of what it means, let's say Germany and France seeing themselves as friends, competition, or enemies. This is the relationship between 2 actors, which then takes on an objectivity, an objective point that France and Germany have, relatively speaking, a good relationship. Not always historically, not 1870 to 1871, the Franco-Prussian War, not the First or Second World War, but today this relationship is very different, and it's because of this intersubjectivity, how we learn from each other. And it can be positive or negative, of course. I can demonize you. And the final one, which takes us a little bit more into a theory, which I'm going to go into more detail later, post-structuralism, how we use language to construct a particular language. So if I say a threat, or there's a threat of this particular state actor or non-state actor, and I keep repeating it. So after 9/11, the Bush administration keep referring to Al-Qaeda as this great danger, this evil. Not just that it killed this actor, 3,000 innocent people, but that it can do it over and over again in many different places, and worst case scenario, get access to weapons of mass destruction. If I can make that argument, and others in the audience, the US public opinion, political elites, other countries can believe that, then it constructs a new social reality. And we live in a post 9/11 world. for better or worse, which impacts on all our actions. So going on to Marxism and critical theory, we're looking at here and going back to the thinking of Karl Marx, but Karl Marx has a key influence on some of the key thinkers that we're going to come across. But basically, and you can see, by the way, in each of the slides, I put down key names for you to think about and look at. But again, I'm going to talk more in class, and you'll see in future presentations. But Marxists, generally speaking, look at inequality between different classes. So historically, the term bourgeois, the owners of capital, and the proletariat, the working classes, and a conflict, and how there needs to be an overcoming of this, where there is a sharing of resources, where the working class rise up, and you have a completely equal world. What we are not focusing in on when I look at Marxism or critical theory, we're not focusing in on whether capitalism should be overthrown or not. Of course, we can certainly, as you as IR and political people, IR and in some cases also for PP students, can look at capitalism, the pros and cons and equivalent and different socioeconomic systems. But for international relations, we look at why there are particular powerful actors in this world, why there are particular powerful actors that are in particular powerful positions. So whether it's governments, the US, China, etc., various European Union countries, why they're rich and why they're poor countries. Why is it though, and let's bring in non-state actors, why is it, let's say, that there are companies like Amazon, obviously today, previously Microsoft, and many other companies, ExxonMobil, Siemens, Sony, etc., which these companies, in some cases, the case of Amazon, may have a larger amount of money that it makes profit-wise than a country does. So one company is more powerful than a whole range of let's say, developing countries. So that's the power of commerce, companies, and their role. So not all states are equal. And not all, and states can be hugely influenced by these private interests, according to Marx's thinking. In the 1960s, and the New Left, we were talking about economic imperialism of the US. So it wasn't just about class struggle, but actually states played a role. And this is where international relations becomes important, that states played this role. Again, as I should emphasize, because this is a lot to get through. So thank you for being patient and us going through this marathon. But basically, I will go into more detail in future presentations. But to say again, the world systems theory looks at how there's a hierarchical system of the core countries, the most powerful, most developed economies, G7, etc. So France, Germany, the US, Japan, etc. Semi-periphery countries that are mid-ranking economically, that produce certain products, natural resources, oil, gas, etc. Often in these categories, Russia, Venezuela, Turkey, historically, Saudi Arabia have been put there, that contribute to the global economy. And then you have the periphery countries that contribute little to the global economy. This is a structuralist approach to understanding why there's inequality between states, and we'll be looking at more detail. This is a thinker from the late 1970s onwards. Critical theory, influenced by Antonio Gramsci and the Frankfurt School, so early 20th century thinkers. Robert W. Cox is an important thinker here, brings in, let's say, the superstructure. So it's not all about economics. There's also ideas. So you have the base, which is economics, according to Marx, and you have the superstructure, which are legal, political, social institutions. And according to critical theory, if we want to understand why capitalism reproduces itself, or why certain state or non-state actors continue to be powerful, we have to look at how these institutions have evolved historically, why we take them for granted, why there's some legitimacy. So there's an element of constructivism here, dare I say, on this point, why they get certain legitimacy, why the particular ideas, belief systems, norms have come to be where they are. But also, according to critical theorists, can we change this? Is there something we can do as a social actor, social movement, non-state actors, sometimes state actors? Can we do something to improve the global order? And if so, how? And this is where we have to have sensitivity to history, institutions, etc. Feminist thought looks at key aspects that we have to differentiate here. So, yes, biology, there is a biological reality. There is, let's say, notions that so not just notions, sorry, biological and brute facts. Okay, so when we look at the world that we live in and we talk about power politics, that is not necessarily a brute fact. A brute fact, as I've referred to before when I was talking about constructivism, gravity. or let's say chromosome. There's a chromosome, XX and XY chromosome, which makes one male and one female. And I appreciate that in post-structuralist thought, that even this notion of gender is something that we have to consider very sensitively. However, if we can, let's say, looking at chromosomes XX and XY, what have you, that actually one being female, one being male from birth, that's a biological reality. And most feminists, not all, but most feminists would sign up to that there is biological reality. However, and this is what feminists, and there's a whole different range of schools of thought, which I'll go into: liberal, critical, post-structural, post-colonial, etc., in my feminist slides. But their key ontological change assumption is that gender is a social issue. So there's a social construction. So when it tells, let's say, not just men to be tough, but also states that you have to be tough, you have to do power politics and just look at the elites, that's a choice that's been made. And that's a reason why the world is in the state that it's in. If we consider, let's say, actually the thoughts and beliefs of people suffering on the ground, so more grassroots, this more critical approach, or if we think even of political leaders that actually don't need to be macho and posturing. And it's not just that you have to be, you're male and posturing, but we've been socialized to be this particular way. So for feminist thinking, and this is not just an IR, but more broadly, it's a social issue. So again, when you look at something how COVID-19 has been dealt with, or let's say avoiding war, is it the case that, let's say, state actors and heads of states can actually be more conciliatory, can care more for each other, etc., etc.? If so, that can, hypothetically speaking, lead to a more positive outcome, which is an aspect of what feminist thought tries to do, tries to, again, challenge things we take for granted, that it's not all about power politics and that we're competition and security. And according to feminists, but not just feminists, also any school of critical theory and constructivists, if we believe that, let's say, we're hardwired, that you have to be tough, you are this way, self-interested, this has a self-fulfilling prophecy and creates this unstable, conflictual, very unequal world. So feminists are not just saying, oh, we want to make lives better for women, but we want to make the lives better for everyone. And so notions of anarchy that we have of how you can't trust and there's no supranational authority is problematic. And actually, we can trust. It's not innate in our nature to be one way or the other. It's very much a socialization process. And a great critical feminist thinker like Cynthia Enloe, she looks at what is the possibilities. She looks at people on the ground. So so she wants to understand women's experiences, but not just the case of women, it could be men, children as well, of course. But how do they, let's say, are they affected by, let's say, a war? So the United States and the United Kingdom invades Iraq in 2003. How do the people on the ground in Iraq experience it? Women, men, women and children, how are they experiencing it? How can we help people not just in Iraq on the ground, but also elsewhere? And is it the case that we need governments to invade a country or to put sanctions on Iraq in the case of 1990s, if this is going to lead to people being much, much, much worse off? Again, in the case of Iraq, there's one caveat I put there in that there was a totalitarian dictator, Saddam Hussein, but nonetheless, has the situation got much better since 2003? Dare I say no? And therefore, how has that actually helped in a normative way improve the situation for the people of Iraq? So feminists and other critical approaches want to look at this. They want to look at how we can create an international order where, let's say, this creates the possibility for an order where there is more peaceful interactions, etc. Finally, of the different theories, post-structuralism, which I'll go into in more detail, again, in a future presentation. Forgive me for saying that again. There's no neutral vantage point. So when we look at a world, there's different narratives, different belief systems. So this is a part of the large umbrella of constructivism. Constructivism is a school of thought in its own right, but feminists, critical theory, and post-structuralists could come under this umbrella of constructivism in that how we're socialized, belief systems, etc., etc. However, for post-structuralists, they take it one step forward than more mainstream constructivists in saying that everything has a certain narrative and there's nothing that's entirely objective, and therefore we have to just understand how different actors are trying to increase their own, let's say, power, how they're trying to, so when they use narrative and they try to create it, they're trying to put themselves in a more powerful position, whether you're the US or the UK or China, whatever the case might be. So we have to look at how language and knowledge is made and the relationship between the two. And we have to see how things are eventually seen as axiomatic, as a habit, as right, as objective, but nonetheless we have to always acknowledge that it's been constructed over time as a process, and therefore critically we have to challenge certain processes and institutions that come into play. And we have to acknowledge that they're never neutral. So post-structuralists are very different to realists who take this more materialist, it's all about material power. Post-structuralists put more of an emphasis on ideas, norms, belief systems, narratives, stories we tell. But nonetheless, there's a small connection with realists in that they also emphasize it's about power relations. But they are more skeptical and critical of particularly the more powerful actors for reproducing a particular global order that they're happy with or that they benefit from, or reconstruct inequality. So post-structuralists in this way have a connection with other critical approaches to IR theory. And there's no exact facts about the political and social world, only interpretations of answer and political vantage point. I should say something which is important. What post-structuralists are not saying, because this is sometimes a critique of post-structuralists, is that they say that anything that's happened historically, an event that's happened, didn't happen. No. The Cold War very much happened. The Holocaust, the Shoah very much happens, and post-structuralists would never deny any of that. What they are arguing, though, is how we understand events. Some of these horrible events, like the destructive, horrible event like the Holocaust, or other events in the world that we historically, whether we refer to a genocide or something less extreme. The point is that there is a vantage point. So people are arguing a particular point so that they can achieve a particular outcome for themselves, to achieve a particular objective, whether you as an individual or you as a state or you as a non-state actor. And often what in the mainstream, so realist or liberal institutionalist approaches according to post-structuralists, it's often how we live in this world. It's very, there's some complexity, but actually we can fit everything together. And actually there are states, there are non-state actors, and you see how they interact. Well, actually, according to post-structuralists, the world is complex. There's richness, there's diversity, there's otherness, there's many different actors. And to say that to simplify too much is problematic. Why? Because the world is often made due to distinction, otherness. And actually, if you look at political actors, they often, so let's say when countries say we're civilized, you're barbaric, and this is where you get into post-colonial thought, that actually historically European powers would say that about others to reinforce their own power relations. We always need to think systematically, critically, of why certain states are trying to create otherness. However, in a more positive sense, diversity and relationships and hybridity, how we influence each other culturally, and how we are both influencing each other, is a positive thing according to post-structuralists. But, final point on this, often it's the powerful actors themselves that create knowledge and create actually how we see the world, politically speaking. And coming to a conclusion, and again, thank you very much for your time and attention for this major groundwork of international relations. So we've done a lot of groundwork, Grundlages, as one would say in German, or West London. And IR theory helps us to understand international relations and foreign policy, a subject area that I'm going to go into detail next semester with you. And let's look at some key factors again. Let's remind ourselves. So it identifies key patterns and processes, how IRs worked, how we can think of things in a more systematic, deeper level. 2, these paradigms, concepts, and it gives us an insight when we want to look at an issue area. Again, whether it's the environment, political economy, security, whatever the case might be, we can apply not only theory, but also concepts connected with the theory. And also these glasses that I speak about, these glasses that we have to understand the world, depending on the color of the glasses, the lenses, it's going to give us a slightly different idea of how the world works. Again, it's not to say that all theories are the same, because all theories that all theories have the same value. One theory might be more relevant than the other, and this is something we'll talk about. But each theory obviously gives us a certain picture of reality and gets us closer, if we can think of the different theories, gets us closer to the so-called overall picture, reality of the situation we are living in politically, socially, economically. An eclectic approach, so where we can also show how these different theories might have relations, which we can talk about again more in class, is also a way of us getting closer to a so-called reality. But eclecticism itself but has strengths in that sense, in that it can create a situation whereby by applying, let's say, realism, constructivism, feminism, we can get a general picture. But it's problematic in a sense if it blurs the lines too much, because each of these theories, I also want to emphasize, have their own distinctive aspects as well. Now, thank you very much for your attention. This is a question: what should the study of international relations be focused on, and why? And I'm now going to end this presentation, and again want to thank you, and I will be talking more. There will be more, let's say, questions in the session for us to go into more detail. Thank you, though, for your attention. And I just want to, again, for this marathon, that we're the first session marathon, we've covered a lot of ground. Please, again, do not be too concerned if you haven't picked everything up, because there's a lot of details that I will be repeating in this module. But I really, really thank you for your attention, and we'll be doing more practice and speaking about it in class. So for now, I just want to, again, say thank you and speak soon, or see you in class. All the best. Bye-bye.